So we're finally moving on to trade policy. So what type of trade policies could exist? And the first one here is autarky. So by now you should know what autarky means. It means that you are entirely dealing within your own country. There's no relationship or trading happening with any other foreign country. Does that exist in this world? Maybe North Korea could be an example in that case. And then we have a liberal policy. That means that you have no tariffs or anything in place. You trade with another country without restrictions. And then the last form, which is almost most of the world has this type of trade policy, is to have protectionism. So there's some tariff that exists, even if it's small. So we've seen from the earlier weeks that trade usually, or from the trade models, it usually shows that there's some beneficial trade that can occur if countries traded without any restrictions in place. But we found that even though this model exists, we have some views that blame international economics, globalization, international trade flows, international factor movements, limitations of the model, that these trade models or international trade as per se doesn't actually result in efficiency, doesn't really result in mutual trade in it. So people blame all these listed topics here for these type of things. So why do they blame them? Why are they blamed? They say firstly this unemployment that is caused. So your trade model says, okay, enter into trade with another foreign country, and what happens from their point of view is, but now you're specializing in one product, but what happens in the other market where jobs are lost on them? They don't look at it entirely and say, okay, these people are getting transferred from the sector to another sector. They're looking at merely as a spectrum. If I'm trading with you, um, there's now international competition. We cannot compete with this international competition, and then our factories close, and now we get unemployment. We lose jobs in that sense. They also then say, okay, we're facing other countries' wages. So in order for us to compete with another country like China or something where wages is low, we can't compete with it. So we have to either lower our wages to be competitive, or industry goes kaput in that sense. At the same time, they say, okay, we're trading, and are we looking out at what are the effects of mass producing or building these factories or stuff like that? Or are we just looking merely at what gains we're gaining in one industry, or are we looking at what are the side effects this industry can cause on other issues and that, on other markets and that. So international trade is then seen as causing issues in that. That is providing unfair competition. It's causing low development levels because we're not ensuring that our industry grows firstly in that. So these are the things people look at. Instead of the bigger picture, they're looking at, oh, yes, one sector we're losing at. They're not looking, okay, we might be losing or having less development in this industry because we can't be competitive in that. But the other industry where we actually have a comparative advantage or something like that, we're actually gaining there. And if we concentrate in that, we may be able to shift that. That's according to the trade model. So obviously trade models aren't perfect, and that's why they get tackled, or they get targeted and finding and looking at all the assumptions and stuff like that. So what happens then? So now you have all these contrasting views, and so we have all these contrasting views that comes forth, And you're thinking, whoa, why? Why? So, in essence, then, these contrasting views get put forth. And who's going to step in here? Somebody's going to voice their mind, and then someone's going to say something, and some persuade, most likely government, to do something about this. How are they going to do this? So this is the ways government can impose their form of restrictions on international firms or on foreign companies from dealing and doing trade with us. So the first way they could do this is to applying a specific tariff. Right? That's a certain amount that you charge per unit. So you say this tax or the tariff for every apple you bring into this country will charge you $1. And then they can go and do a ad valorem tariff and just saying for every apple that you bring in, we're going to charge you 10% of that price as a tariff. Then there are other types of policies they can do, and that's the non-tariff instruments or non-tariff barriers they can use. So quota would fall under that. A subsidy would fall under that. You can either subsidize in the production or you can subsidize in the export side of it. Um, then you got other restrictions that might get in place, and you say, okay, you must tender to import to our country. So now you say, okay, there's a contract if you want to enter, pay for it firstly, so you can now bring a product in. Um, Secondly, you might say, okay, you want to send this kind of product to our country, but we want 20% of this product being produced here, or we have to have some form of impact in this production process for you to bring the product here. And then you have prohibition, you just ban the product outright, or you have a regulation. So, say for instance, if you bring a product in, it needs to meet certain standards and that. Um, or you're just doing these regulation and putting these standards on the product and um, processing this good just mainly to make sure this product takes forever to reach our shores. So it comes fast, comes to our border very fast, and then it comes to the processing plants and then everything gets inspected. You slow down the process there in the inspection, and then you look at, okay, are you keeping to the laws that we have set? Are you keeping to the standard we set? And now you lengthen the process, and in the end, it takes so long for your product to reach here that it might have increased in price through that process, or it's just not worth your time. For you to get this product to market in an overseas market and it takes forever to get to that market, you might just think, oh, when I start seeing my profits in that, even though um, it is profitable for me to go to this foreign market, you might be thinking, no, by the time I see my profits, it's probably better for me to find another place to sell this. Then you get VERs, voluntary export restrictions. We're going to discuss that soon. And then you have something called most favored nation, and that is just like, oh, it's a world trade arrangement in a sense that if everybody who belongs to the World Trade Organization and I, as a country, decide as one of those members of the World Trade Organization, decides to business with another country who's part of the World Trade Organization or a member of them, and I decide to, okay, I'm going to reduce my tariffs on apples here by 10%, automatically, because we all part, all the other countries who are part of or members of the World Trade Organization, automatically they will also get a reduction in the price of apples by 10%. So that is just what most favored nation means. Any rule or any agreement that you put in place with another country, what that means that you need to extend that agreement to all other countries who are part of the World Trade Organization, who are members on it. Yeah, so that is something that you need to look in. Okay, yes, there are exceptions sometimes when you enter into bilateral agreements and certain agreements and that, then you can, it's a possibility that those arrangements might not be extended to most favored nations. Um, but for now, just assume that there are exceptions to everything, and you have to probably apply or go through a process, or because entering into a bilateral agreement or into regional agreement is seen as in a favor of free trade, then there are exceptions allowed against the most favored nation idea. So what are for voluntary export restrictions? So voluntary export restriction is exactly like a quota, except that, say for instance, I am country A and have arrangement with country B. Country B is sending a good towards us. Usually, as country A, we can say no, we're only going to allow 20,000 in. What you do in this case in country A is you're not enforcing a quota. You are leaving to country B to design this quota, to voluntarily not bring all the product into the market and just say, okay, country B, we're gonna export to country A only 20,000. They usually do this. Why? Because they are scared that if they allow country A to dictate this quota on that, it might be worse off than them deciding themselves to limit the product. So they would do something like that. And at the same time, by doing something like that, country B enforcing themselves not to ship too many products to country A, then they are preventing government from gaining any revenue. So the export country then reaps the full rewards from a product like that. Versus country A, they would have gained a reward if government had ensured a quota or something. But there's a way around this. So what the country A would then do, um, to avoid maybe voluntary export restriction, or to ensure that they can, in a way, place a quota out, then they allow tenders. They auction off the rights to import this product, um, or to allow for the foreign countries to export to them. They issue auction for the rights to do this, and by doing this auction and that, they are gaining a revenue. So that is the way government will get money. Then, in a sense, is they're auctioning. Oh, we want to allow 20,000 product who's willing to come and buy this. The foreign country buys the rights for that 20,000, and in a sense, the government gets the money again. So there are ways that a country will still win. The country is importing the product, but that's just unfortunate. So the way around this. So for the exporting country, the one is exporting the product to country A. They got ways to maybe um, get around this, and I mean, yeah, to limit the product willingly. They might say, okay, we don't want to limit the product willingly. Come, come, we as a country help, or tell country, hey, look here, we're gonna design um, plants, or we're gonna invest in some of your country's plants to allow for us to export the product to you, or in a sense allow importing our product into country A to be easier. And what they do then with these plants, which they call screwdriver plants, is that in essence these plants are probably maybe only used to assemble the goods or something like that. So these plants do very minimal in the production process, but they do enough to entice the other country um, to not prevent the product from allowing, basically from allowing the product to freely flow into the country. So they're allowing this. They're not trying to prevent this product from flowing in and out. And then there's the other way around this. The export country, which is country B, will invest or put a certain amount of money in the central bank of the importing country, country A, and they wouldn't earn a return. So this is like a form of trust in that. It's like, yeah, we give you money, we put it here. It's a loan in essence, but we don't want a return on the loan. And then that central bank would then use that money to generate income from or something like that. In a way, and it's also for insurances and stuff like that. So these are the ways around verse. This is a very common question I used to give in terms of short questions back in the day. I used to ask people what are verse and what are the ways around it. I used to ask about the plural form of verse, which is called the orderly market agreement. And then people would know what verse is, but they didn't know that orderly market agreement is like a plural form. A lot of verse put together in a sense. In a sense, when you have multiple countries and you are now um, applying a restriction to all those countries at the same time. Anyways, so it's very unlikely I'll give definitions, especially if it's cut and paste from your work for examiner. So expect your essays, always hinting at what you're getting. But I will never talk in definitives. I will never say 100%. If I do, then be assured it is. The only assurance I gave you is from that you definitely from your essays that you've been doing, you'll be getting 2 of them at least in your exam. But the questions might be rephrased, but in essence, I'm looking for almost 100% exactly the same. So then we can move on to tariffs. So this is all definitions and an average tariff. So it's just based on weighting all the imports of various goods and services into a country by the value of the import flows. And it's very complex to calculate. And then you have a prohibitive tariff. So they're just setting a tariff so high that you stop all importing of the good. Now, the problem with that is actually a tariff you're in placing, right? You're putting in place. But when you do an average tariff calculation, what happens is you're putting a zero weighting or zero flow for your tariff in that. And then in the end, it doesn't even form part of your average tariff calculation because the zero flows of the product. But in fact, it is actually a very high tariff that you're putting in place, and now it's not taken in consideration because of the flow. So that is one of the problem of average tariff, that it doesn't take prohibitive tariffs into consideration. And then you get something called the effective tariff. And there's a short, which is just showing you a combination of tariff rates. So it's usually on your intermediate good and your final good. It looks at something like that. And here's a short calculation. So before I would ask this usually in the module test, but you don't have a module test this year. So usually speaking, I will show this calculation and then I'll ask him, okay, based on you showing this calculation, then what if this happen? What if this happen? How does that affect your calculation? But I would never give any values. I would ask the student to create their own values in that. The things you need to know is that is for the terms of the calculation, right? So the calculation for effective tariff rate is 100 times the remuneration under tariffs minus remuneration over remuneration. So this calculation you need to know. What is the remuneration? Remuneration is the difference between your finished product and your intermediate goods, or your finished product and your raw materials. So in our case, here's the world price. The raw materials are 40 Rand. The finished product is 85 Rand. 85 Rand minus 40 Rand would be your remuneration under non-tariffs. All I have to do is for remuneration under tariffs is that I have to take the raw materials, add a tariff to it, take the finished product, add a tariff to it, and then subtract the two to find the remuneration under tariffs. That is the only difference there. Then you can just plug it straight in the formula. So for our example, we have raw materials of 40 Rand, we have finished product of 85%, of 85 Rand. You have a finished product, imports, tax or tariff at 15%, and then you have the raw materials tariff at 8%. And I ask you what is the effective level or the effective tariff level of protection. When you go into calculation, you calculate your remuneration without tariffs, which has just been 85 minus 40, which is 45. And then you calculate your remuneration under tariffs. So you first take your raw materials, you take your 40 Rand and you times it by your tariff rate, which is 1,08 or 8% increase in price, and it will give you 43,2. And then you take your finished product and you adjust it for tariffs, which is 85 times 15%, or added 15% to 85, which will give you 97,75. And then you calculate your remuneration under tariffs, which is 97,75 minus 43,2, and that gives you 54,45. Now you can jump in the calculation. So from the calculation, you put in your 100, which is part of the formula. You put in your remuneration under tariffs. You put your remuneration in, ignoring tariffs, and then you divide by your remuneration ignoring tariffs, and you'll get 21,2%. So that is your effective tariff, 21,2%, which takes into consideration your 15% and your 8% tariff. Usually some people will just say, hey, oh, there's a tariff of 8% for raw materials and a tariff of 15% for your final product. The add them is 23%. But that's not exactly what you do. For effective tariff, you go based on this calculation and you find it's 21,2%, and not actually 25%, 23%, if you had added those two together. Okay, so how does this calculation change? What are the things that would affect it? So the larger the share of your raw materials in the production process, the larger the tariff would be. So that is saying through the whole process of production, which takes into consideration your wages and other things through the process, the more raw materials proportion is of all your production cost process, the bigger your tariff would be. And then the lower your tariff on your raw materials, so that meaning that 8% was reduced to 6%, then the larger your effective tariff would be. And also the higher your tariff on your finished product, so the 15% that you had increasing maybe to 20%, and then the larger your effective tariff would be. So having said all these things, I would then ask them, especially for the last two, for lowering the tariff on a raw material, to do example. So you do example now, you keep everything the same as it was. You still have the 40 Rand. You still have your 40 Rand for raw materials. You still have your 85 Rand for finished product. You still have your 15% for production on imports, and then you change this amount, 8%. You make it 6%, 7%, 5%, whatever you want to do. And then do the calculation over again. And then that last scenario where you have the tariff increase in the finished product, and it'll go again to the example. You keep the raw materials price the same, you keep your finished product price the same, you keep your imports on the raw material price the same at 8%, but then you change this 15% on finished product tariffs to whatever amount you want to, 17%. Obviously, you could use your own values in all this process in there. And I asked them to do the calculation, and I asked them to do this maybe for 10 marks or so. It's a simple thing, it's not hard. But yeah, I would phrase it in a way that I would ask for effective tariff, and you need to think I was actually asking this. Okay, so that's effective tariff. Just a bit idea into it. Then we go into partial equilibrium of a tariff and general equilibrium of a tariff. So I will skip entirely the general equilibrium of a tariff. It is self-read for you. The reason why I'm skipping this is part of micro. This was heavily done in micro. Even this partial part you have done in some form over your undergraduate even. So you would have seen the partial sign under undergraduate and under micro in your postgraduate. You would have seen the general equilibrium form. I'm not going to test this graphs. I just need to understand what the graph is effectively saying or why people have argued for one point of view, especially from the partial equilibrium side. Um, it's better for discussion than the general equilibrium side, which most people would ignore when trying to push for a policy. Okay, so as a reminder, what a small country tariff is. So under normal spectrum, this P2 price here is the autarky price of a product of demand and supply. That is the price you would find in the market. So under normal circumstances, without having a foreign market or international price, P2 and would have been the price in this country, and Q2 would have been the quantity supplied in this country. So now what happens is we open our world to international trade, and then the international trade price is P0. So this dotted line going across here is your world price. So then what you need to be able to do from that is say, okay, originally speaking, this triangle here, that was your consumer surplus initially, and then you need to say, okay, this triangle here, this was my producer surplus initially under autarky. You needed to be able to give that discussion in first year or second year whenever you did this, I can't remember. Then you need to say, okay, when you introduce a new world price of P0, you need to say, okay, what is my producer surplus now? So initially speaking, under autarky, this big triangle here was my producer surplus. Now my producer surplus under the world the price is now only this small triangle here. Alright? Now, what is your consumer surplus? Your consumer surplus under the world price is this big triangle here. So here, just that one there. As you all should be familiar. If you're struggling with this, I don't know then. So that is your new consumer surplus under the world price. So there was a big gain of this trapezoidal shape here, or trapezium as you would call. Okay, that's it. And then you need to say, okay, what happens under tariff? Under tariff, or yep, and under tariff, you're pushing the world price up from P0 to P0 times 1 plus T. Alright? We're assuming what type of tariff is that? Alright, go back to the beginning and then see is that a specific tariff or ad valorem tariff or whatever. I don't really care. But either way, a tariff increases the price of the product from the international price is a shifter. Then you needed to be able to discuss, okay, what happens if producer surplus? So this is the argument I need you to remember from the diagram. So your producer surplus move from that small shape under autarky to this bigger shape under autarky here. Effectively, what has happened here? Your production has changed within your country from Q0 to Q1. What does that mean? Your production is increased from a partial perspective. What has happened? Production has increased means most likely jobs has increased. This has created employment. Alright? So we have the small producer surplus increasing to the big producer surplus. And what has happened in terms of consumer surplus? So consumer surplus was the big triangle. Now consumer surplus is just this triangle going up till P0 times 1 plus T. So we've lost effectively there's a whole portion here. Right? In terms of consumer surplus. But we gain a portion of that producer surplus. Then you needed to be able to discuss, okay, with that tariff increase, this block here was your gain, your government's revenue gain, and then you needed to say, okay, these small triangles here is your deadweight loss or your Harbinger triangles, your deadweight loss. So you have lost that entirely. Now, so this is the problem of tariffs, right? This is also the argument people will use. Okay, you lost it entirely. That's why it's bad for you to impose a tariff, even though you would have gained jobs from Q0 to Q1, because consumers would lose overall in a sense. Okay, so that is something you need to pick up. That the tariff creates jobs through increased production. That is important, all right? This is what people will lobby from. So it's something you need to remember. So this is the things we discussed in the diagram. So what you find is after my diagram, I always jot down things that you needed to discuss or I need to discuss on the board when I was doing these type of questions. So it's not entirely possible for me to now draw a board for you. And obviously, I can pull up uh, paint or something like that to draw, but these diagrams I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on because you should know these diagrams from previous years. So this is the argument only the job creation. So for political purpose, the organization comes in. Look here, from imposing a tariff, we can create job creation, and the government jumps on his list. You true, we can create jobs here, and then this is what they push through. And the problem is why they can push it through is how many consumers is versus how many producers is. So they look at this from a perspective as like a consumer. How many consumers? There are millions and millions or billions of consumers. So when they get this loss or consumer surplus, it is spread amongst how much? Millions and billions of them. So the loss each person faces is very, very small when you impose a tariff. From a producer's perspective, there's only 4 or 5 producers. So these producers will these 5 producers maybe or whatever they are 4 or 5 they will lobby together and say, oh, and the reason why they lobby together, the gain is big for them. So for them to push this through is, or to pursue government or to try to push for this tariff would be in their favor. So they jump together and they try to do this. Consumers are like, we are losing little. They're not. No one's really worried about this very small little that they are losing. And in the end, the producers gain, even though overall the loss would have been more for the country overall. But the producers gain this because they're able to lobby better together, while consumers don't really see this effort for the small little they're losing, and they don't get together and oppose the idea, or they oppose it maybe later when they realize what is happening. Um, but yeah, in the end, they get the tariff increase, the producers. Um, they get the job creation. At the same time, from a government perspective, is they're gaining a revenue of the tariff, so they're happy to do this at the same time. At the same time, they can be saying, "Oh, we're creating local jobs," right? Instead of government looking at, "Oh, we're creating maybe jobs through trade, good free trade agreements where we specialize and we create more jobs that way, which is better overall for society." Obviously, this is from a partial equilibrium perspective. Okay, so these are some of the issues that you need to discuss. If I were to ask you about, maybe this is more of a short type question because this is not something you can pull off and cut and paste for definitions. It's like to ask you about the political view for international trade when discussing a tariff increase from a partial equilibrium perspective. So this is all the things I discussed. Um, Move forward. And then you can look at it from a large country perspective. I'm not really going to delve too deeply into this. Um, all that you need to know from a large country perspective is that there is potential that the deadweight loss you would have faced under a small country perspective could be cancelled out because you're a large company. How do you cancel that out? You need to look at the idea that the influence and demand a large country has in terms of demand and so you're going to look at it this way. So this is the demand, it will change. Um, what happens when you impose a tariff? It decreases imports. which ultimately results in a decrease in net demand. And since it's a big country, this is going to lower prices. So this is seen as a shift from P0 to P1 because of the decrease in imports resulting in a decrease in net demand. And then based on this P1, the tariff is increased, right, from P1 to P1T. So your position that you're always discussing from is in terms of P0. You still discuss all these other funny things that happen in consumption, consumer surplus, producer surplus. I'm not going to deal with this too much, but I can ask this. But highly unlikely I'm going to give you a graph. But the idea that you need to take from a large country's influence on net demand by lowering the price could offset the loss of the deadweight loss, which are the small triangles, by this gain in terms of revenue that you would get from a reduction in terms of pricing. Anyways, have a look and go read on that. This for me is not critical for the discussion. The above was critical, talking about it from a small country perspective. And that's what most people use for the arguments to lobby for tariffs and that. So then there's general equilibrium stuff on tariffs. Go and read about this. This is self-study. Optimal tariffs and retaliation to deal with general equilibrium, also self-study. Just put some of the graphs to remind you what you need to go read up on. Please don't avoid it. Go read up about it. If you feel it's some technicalities you need to be discussed in the graph, then I will gladly help you and assist you with it. Just that this is more micro issue, the graphs. I'm staying away from it. It's not more. The easiest is ease dealing with trade, ease dealing with tariffs and that. But it's very unlikely that I'll be testing on this. In fact, I probably won't test on that, as I said earlier, for general about general equilibrium, so I don't want. And then we're moving on to counter-free trade arguments and that. And this will be the next part of this week's work, and we will end with this for this week on that.